All right. Thank you for joining me in this episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Martin Wilson, and we have another great show for you today. Thank you for joining me. I have an interview. As you know, The Gospel Truth is here to engage the culture of Christian truth, and we do that through debates, interviews, and Bible lessons. And we deal with cultural aspects, things, cultural situations, things like that. Also, with that said, I have Jonathan Sheffield with me, and we are going to be talking about some objections to the New Testament canon. And Jonathan's going to give some strong responses to these objections. We're going to be doing some Bart, Ehrman, and some Shabir Ali. So I hope you are able to stay with us throughout the duration of this show. That said, I do want to encourage you to go ahead, like and follow The Gospel Truth. Make sure you hit that like, subscribe, and that notification bell so you can stay in the loop with what The Gospel Truth has going on. As you know, or hopefully you know, Gospel Truth is not only on YouTube and Facebook, but it's also on Instagram and Twitter. So make sure that you are flowing over there to stay in the loop with what The Gospel Truth has going on there. Also, all this content is on podcast, so make sure you are subscribing there, Google Play, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify. So make sure that you are in it to win it over there as well. All right. So I'm excited of what The Gospel Truth has going on, and we have a whole bunch of shows coming up here in the future. Let me bring those shows in. I forgot to upload those shows in real quick, but it won't take long for me to get them in. So we have a whole bunch of shows coming up here in the future. There you go. All right, so I have Pastor Milo Ramos who's joining me tomorrow. I know this promotion says the 4th, but he'll be with me tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we're going to be talking about we're going to talk about Romans chapter 9. So we're going to be going through that. Pastor Milo Ramos is very good at what he does, and I expect a great show from him. Coming up after that, I have Robert Wiesner, predestination, election, and the Second Temple Judaism in relation to Pauline theology. So we're going to be talking about some Pauline theology, how it relates to election, predestined election, the Second Temple Judaism. So we're going to get into that. That's going to be coming up February 9th at 5 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So be on the lookout for that as well. And after that, I have my buddy of mine, JD Martin, is going to be coming on, and we're going to be talking about, can Calvinists hold to libertarian free will? All right, so a Calvinist, libertarian free will, I don't know how that's going to flow, but we'll see how it flows. I may have some good questions for this guy for this one, man. This is my dude right here. Me and him talking on the phone and everything. I love talking to him. He's a great man of God, loves the word, loves God, and I'm excited to talk to him about this subject matter. So be on the lookout for that show. And then finally, I've been wanting to do this, and every time I plan to do it, it gets pushed back even more because something comes up with the family or some other thing that takes precedence over this show comes up. So I haven't been able to really get it done in the fashion that I would desire to. So I am pinning this on February 10th. I want to do what is Pelagianism. All right, this is an important topic. It's important because Pelagianism, if you know Pelagius, he taught some pretty interesting, I would say, quote unquote, interesting doctrine. And I think the church needs to know about it because I do believe that we have what I call neo-Pelagianism going on in the church. So I think it's important that we discuss these matters. So that will be coming up February 10th. So be on the lookout for this show. And that is the next 4 shows coming up on The Gospel Truth. And I just want you to stay in the loop with what we have going on here because it's important that you do. It's important that you stay in the loop. So please like and follow, subscribe, do what you have to do to stay in the loop with what The Gospel Truth has going on. That said, I do want to introduce my guest, Jonathan Sheffield. Actually, if you watch Modern Day Debate, he's recently debated Bart Ehrman. All right, and Bart Ehrman is probably one of the leading voices as it comes to the text of the Bible. You know, he's more on the critical side of the Bible, being a skeptic, an atheist. I don't know if he would consider himself an atheist like that, but he certainly has a high level of skepticism, and he criticizes the biblical text, in particular the New Testament, as far as the reliability. So Jonathan Sheffield has debated him on Modern Day Debate. Let me read his bio real quick. So he's from Brooklyn, New York. He served 4 years in the U.S. Navy. Now I gave him a little crap about this. You know, I'm a Navy boy. You know what I'm saying? I 4.5 to go Navy. You know, go Navy. You know, so but he grew up in the Air Force. That grew up and served in the Air Force. And you know they get pampered and stuff, man. So it's all good, man. But he has an MBA and an undergraduate degree in accounting. And in his ministry, he focused on reliability of the New Testament. I'm going to ask him, how did he get into that area where he wanted to particularly focus on that? Because that's an interesting path. Usually, the typical stuff, pastoring and things like that. But when you start just focusing on the New Testament, I'm interested in seeing where his mind was, to what did he encounter to where say, yeah, this is where I want to emphasize my study. He over the last 4 years, he has created 2D and 3D animation. So if you go to his YouTube page, he has a whole bunch of different animation going on, and where he uses that in order to defend the New Testament, all right, defend the Bible. So it's interesting. If you ain't got time, flow over there. His YouTube page is Jonathan Sheffield. So make sure that you go over there and check him out. Also, he like I said, he debated Bart Ehrman and Dr. Richard Carrier and Dr. Robert Price and Matt Dillahunty. These are some of the guys that he was able had the opportunity to debate. So I personally haven't checked all the debates out, but I do encourage you to check them out yourself, to hear the arguments, man, because it's important for us to be able to defend the faith and have a broad spectrum of what we're defending. But that said, let me bring Jonathan in so he can tell us a little bit more about why he got into the New Testament, and what happened to that. So let me bring him in. What's going on, Jonathan? How you doing, man?
Hey, I'm doing very good. Thank you for having me on your show today. Been a longtime fan. Love what you're doing in your ministry. And once again, thanks for having me on.
Thank you, man. Thank you for joining me. Yeah, man, it's exciting. I know I try to get you on a debate, man. I do a bunch of debates on this thing. So I was trying to get you in for the debate, but it's all good, man. I'm glad I got you in for an interview because we do want to discuss the New Testament, man, and the reliability of the New Testament and responding to these objections of the New Testament. As a Christian, as a Christian, we should be willing to be able to at least somewhat defend how the canon came together. Why is the canon reliable? Because you got your skeptics like your Matt Dillahunty's or Bart Ehrmans who are out there, and they're speaking to crowds of people, and they're speaking in a fashion to where they're able to relate to them or be able to speak their language, if that makes sense. So it's easy for them to understand. And so it's important for guys like you to come and train individuals like me in the audience on how to defend the faith and how to defend the Bible. So tell me and my audience, how did you even get drawn into this area, to this path of study?
All right. Well, first off, I grew up in a Christian household. I've been a member of the Episcopal Church growing up my entire life. So proud member of the Anglican Communion. And I think for me, the one question that always I was either asked or discussions I have been participated with, growing up in New York, it's virtually, different groups, different ideas. And one of the questions I have always been asked is, well, where did your Bible come from? Do you know these books were never part of the Bible? They were forged. You have passages in there that don't belong. They were added afterwards. And it wasn't just one or two questions. This has been a constant question that had been asked, as being a Christian by those outside our congregations, and which really had me really hone in on, well, how do I defend the statement that the Bible is reliable? The books that we have are the books that came from the apostles, and that the text that had come down from the first century has been faithfully preserved. And what we have today is the best representatives of that text that was used from the beginning. So for me, it was more of an investigation that I wanted to really delve into in understanding the means by which the text of the New Testament was brought together, and how do we understand that it was faithfully preserved down through over 2,000 years in history.
All right. It's always something that triggers that that bell or triggers that desire, right? So I'm glad that you stepped in and was one of the many individuals who stepped into this area. And as I said, I'm one of those guys who feel that a Christian is not only a theologian, but an apologist as well. I feel that those two areas are key for us to be able to defend the faith, and obviously church history. Those I guess those three areas would be so vitally important for us to be able to defend the faith and be able to have a particular right frame of mind and understanding of what we're dealing with. So I thank you for desiring to jump into that. And as I always do with my guests, when I come in for interviews, I let you know that I'm praying for you, and I'm praying for your ministry, and I'm praying for your family, that you will do a good job at defending faith and do it with honor and integrity, and that you will stand for the faith and relentless standing for the faith. So I do appreciate you in that endeavor. So with that said, so the way this is going to work is that we have some footage from Bart Ehrman, and we have some footage from Shabir Ali, and we are going to interact with these two individuals and their critique of what the New Testament is, the reliability of the New Testament. Also, audience, throughout this critique, feel free to post your questions. If you have questions, post them. I'm sure Jonathan would gladly tackle them. So just make sure you get those questions in. That said, let's get into this because this should be fun. This should be
copies made pretty centuries later. These copies that were made centuries later contain.
Hold on, I ain't trying to give away the video footage, man. Trying to make sure we can come as it comes, man. So let me restart this. And so, all right. So Jonathan, you're gonna tell me when to stop, man. You're gonna tell me when to stop. I'm gonna stop, and you're going to refute Bart Ehrman, man. You know what I mean? So we're gonna get into this. So let's start this.
Question 6, have the Gospels been accurately preserved down through the centuries?
This is a terrific question that I have been interested in for a very long time. My first interest in this particular question about the accurate preservation of the Gospels started out when I was a student at Moody Bible Institute. At Moody Bible Institute, I believed, as did my professors, that the Bible is without error in the autographs. In other words, the originals of the New Testament did not have mistakes in them, even if subsequent copies of the New Testament may have mistakes in them. The problem is, we don't have the originals of the New Testament. What we have are thousands of copies of the New Testament that were made, in most cases, centuries later. We don't have the originals. We have copies made centuries later. These copies that were made centuries later contain numerous mistakes, thousands of mistakes, tens of thousands of mistakes, hundreds of thousands of mistakes. This was a problem for me at Moody Bible Institute, and I decided that I wanted to learn more about the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. I went to Princeton Theological Seminary to study with the foremost scholar in the field, Bruce Metzger. I devoted years of my life to this study. This has been the core of my research for the past 30 years. At some point, I came to the realization that my belief in the inerrancy of the autographs didn't make sense. If God inspired the Bible without error, why hadn't He preserved the Bible without error?
So, do you believe that God preserved the Bible without error? And do you think that's important as far as the biblical text? See what Bart Ehrman just said. What do you think?
Yeah, so Bart starts off that we don't have the originals, and that's a given. We don't. Most ancient documents from that period of the first, second, third century has not survived up until this particular time. So we don't have the originals, so we can't argue from the originals because we just don't have them. Now, what we do have is copies that have come down through the channels of independent churches throughout the Greek, Latin, and Aramaic speaking world that are descended from those that were closest to Jesus the apostles. So while we don't have the originals, we do have primarily the original churches that were set up to administer the word to its congregations, to the people. So the texts that, or the copies that are extant today have come down, what we do have from the churches are descendant from that period. So the question that Dr. Ehrman is not dealing with is, which copies are we talking about? Are we talking about the copies that have come down through the official chairs and seats of the apostles, and or are we talking about documents that were out there outside the official churches that people were able to get their hands on and do whatever they want with? So when we talk about preservation, we're talking about those that were in a position to oversee not only the physical transfer of the text that came into their position, but did they have means or a structure in place to ensure the faithful preservation? And I think what gets overlooked here is we didn't just have one particular congregation or church that was tasked to this. We have many churches that were set up, independent representative churches of the apostles across the Greek, the Latin, and the Aramaic speaking world that was assigned this particular task. So the question we need to be looking at is was there to oversee and be guardians of the text a system to ensure the preservation of it, which Dr. Ehrman doesn't go into. He makes a general vague comment about copies and doesn't speak to the system in place to ensure the preservation of the text.
So he also mentions, he said something about, there's these thousands and thousands and thousands of mistakes, and the way that he conflates it, it almost seems as if he's saying that, well, these mistakes are taken away from core doctrine. These mistakes are taken away from core aspects of the scriptures, of the text, of the faith. Are there thousands of mistakes that are taken away from the Bible? Thus, the Bible is not reliable. What do you think?
Well, what Dr. Ehrman is actually referring to is a handful of manuscripts. And when I say handful, I am talking about probably a group of probably two main texts and about maybe 43 pieces of text here and there. Now, there's a group of texts that have no provenance. So we don't know where these texts actually come from. So we need to make a distinction between the text, because Ehrman is actually referring to textual documents that come thousands or 1,000 years later that are extant today, that we have today. And he's talking about documents that we can date pretty early, but we don't know where they come from. And when we look at these documents, yeah, they're very different from each other. They have all these mistakes. There's many differences in them. But what he kind of steps away from is when we talk about we have 5,000 plus Greek manuscripts, most of those are from a period dating after the 9th century. And while there are differences, and once again, this is there are going to be some differences, but when we look at collectively as a whole, they represent a common form of the text that was used throughout these churches. Then when we look at together, it represents a core form of the text that has been in use from the church. So in those, a lot of the errors that he's talking about is spelling mistakes, scribal differences, and we're not talking about anything that is that you're going to throw out the Bible on. What we're talking about is there are some textual contexts that are under dispute, but what Ehrman is referring to is that there's a series of documents that look much differently than the text that is represented from the 9th century forward. So what he's saying is, in this other group of manuscripts, there are tremendous differences. There are passages that are not contained in those documents that are represented in there. And what Dr. Ehrman is trying to create in his narrative is an evolution of the New Testament text where things were just thrown into it. Over time, it kind of grew larger and larger. And from the very beginning, they were very dispersed. And there was no uniformity of the text. So he's saying that over a process of over 1,000 years, there was a mechanism to standardize the text. And because we see how different it was from the very beginning, what was standardized and kind of put together, what he believes was put together over the course of many centuries, cannot be trusted or reliable, because when we look at the very earliest forms of the New Testament, there's all these errors. And what we have is someone manipulating the text, whether for good or bad reasons. They're manipulating the text and promoting a propaganda view that the text has always been preserved. So Ehrman isn't giving all the information here. What he's saying is we have these groups of manuscripts from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century that don't look like doesn't look like the type of text that we see being used in the churches. But what Dr. in that statement is he's unable to foundation that the text that he's referring to as earlier ever belonged to any of the official churches. So he cannot lay a foundation to say the text that we found from earlier generations were actually used by the churches. We know of other groups outside the official churches that also had texts. Once again, the Christian church did not have state power. They cannot control what was going on in the streets outside their congregations to force, the stopping of people using road texts out in the ancient world. They were all over the place. We know of publications that they tried to produce, but that doesn't mean that those texts are representative of the type of texts that were used in the official churches. So when we talk about Peter's and Paul's church at Rome, the church at Ephesus, the church in Athens, the churches in North Africa, those we have actual official churches, and we know the texts that have come down to them, and those are the ones that we can make an account for. Stuff that's found in the street or in garbage cans that cannot establish any type of chain of custody to any of these official churches, these are unknown documents. Just like you couldn't go into courts with unknown documents to plead your case, Dr. Ehrman cannot make an assumption that these are the official texts, what he finds out there in the ancient world, unless he can show they actually belong to the official churches.
Interesting. So let's continue on with this, and let's see what else Bart Ehrman has to say.
I couldn't think of a good answer then, and I still can't think of a good answer now, even though I think I've heard every answer ever proposed. I couldn't any longer believe that God had inspired the originals because I was sure he had not preserved the original. Let me tell you now what I think about this entire situation, which is that we cannot know whether the Gospels have been preserved accurately through the ages, and I'm going to try and illustrate with you by explaining how it worked. Take the Gospel of Mark. Whenever Mark was written, say it was written in the year 65 or in the year 70, in the city of Rome, say, I don't know where it was made. Whoever wrote Mark put it in circulation, and somebody copied the Gospel of Mark. Then somebody copied that copy, and somebody copied the copy of the copy. Then somebody copied the copy of the copy of the copy of the copy. And we don't have any of those copies.
See, and I would say, see, that's the thing is that he continues to do this. He seems to, because the copy. Therefore, it's not reliable. Therefore, there's nothing in place to ensure the reliability of the biblical text.
Okay, so yeah, let's, and this is a part I was kind of looking forward to talk to. Now, first, when you hear Dr. Ehrman's narrative, now there's no names, it's somebody. Now, somebody is not, it's somebody, there's no name, there's no date, there's no epicenter. He doesn't talk about a city as, even though he's like, well, maybe in Rome, we don't know. Well, of course we don't. We're talking about a physical text that was published all over the ancient world and found its way into churches in Rome, Alexandria, all over Greece, North Africa, in India. This was a text that made its way through the ancient world. So because we're talking about not only a spiritual document for us, but also a physical one, this came into possession of actual people who spoke on these particular documents. So let's tear down what he said. Now, Dr. Ehrman is kind of conveying a narrative that you have one copy, and then I'm going to give it to you, Marlon, and you're going to make your copy, and then you're going to send it off, and they're going to make their copies. And by the time we get down to the 10th person down the road, we have a big old mess, and we can't see what that 10th person said. But that's not exactly the historical situation. So first, I think it's important because Dr. Ehrman is, modern text critic and historian of the 20th century. But, what we can't is a testimony of those that were part of this system in the ancient world. So when we look at Irenaeus, he tells us a much different narrative on how the church went on to not only receive the text, but what was the means that they had to preserve it. So first and foremost, Irenaeus, in around 180 from Gaul, he tells us that the texts were not only, physically preached on, but they were written and they were handed to the physical churches. And not only that, but he goes on to say that we can actually see what they were. So he tells us in his book Against Heresies that the textual tradition of the apostles are made clear in all the world and can be clearly seen in every church by those that want to behold the truth. So he's giving us an objective framework. We have physical churches in Rome, North Africa, Gaul. We have it all over the ancient world that you can physically go and see the text that is being used in those churches. So it's not something subjective. I can walk into a church, I can see what is being publicly read to the churches. Now, what he also says, Irenaeus, it says we can enumerate those who were established by the apostles as bishops in the churches and the successors down to our town. So what Irenaeus is saying is he's explaining how the churches were set up and organized, and he's also establishing a legal chain of custody for the transmission of the New Testament text through the oversight and succession of the bishops. So what he's done is established the transfer and control procedures to safeguard the text against any tampering to preserve the evidence. Just like in common police investigations, anytime evidence is come into possession of, they secure it and they transfer it to an area to preserve it. Now, in the case of the churches, the texts were provided by the apostles. Now, what Ehrman doesn't notate is that we have Eusebius, we have Clement of Alexandria, and what they're speaking about is statements from these bishops and fathers of the church that says that Mark came into publication in Rome, at the request of the congregations that Peter was preaching, they wanted a written transcript of what Peter had preached. So, coming under advisement, Mark took to record the things that Peter had publicly preached. Now, what Eusebius and Clement testify to, and that is collaborated, is that Peter was also aware of what Mark was doing, and after coming into possession of the gospel publication of Mark, he authorized it to be read in the churches. So the question of, we have ancient testimony that says we know where Mark was created, under what circumstances it was written. We knew it had apostolic authority. It was commissioned to be read in the churches. And when we go to those churches, any church today or in the ancient world, they all testify that that publication that was written with Mark and sanctioned by Peter is Peter's preaching of the gospel at Mark. We know from Peter's letter that Mark was with Peter in Rome. So we have another connection there that, and it's not circumstantial. We have a document from Peter that says Mark was with him. Paul testifies to this. And in Paul and Peter's church, the Gospel of Mark is read from the very beginning. We have bishops, Clement, who was appointed by the Apostle Peter, according to Irenaeus and Tertullian in North Africa, and he is actually quoting in his letters the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, Matthew. And it's not that those that are appointed as oversight in these churches are quoting from their works. This isn't coincidental. So we actually have an actual record. We have the bishops that are recorded in history as having oversight of those churches. And when we look at every single one of those churches, they all come up with Mark. And so when we have independent testimony across a wide geographical area, all naming Mark as it and sharing the same common history, well, the evidence would be conclusive. It's not I don't know or we don't know. We're talking about physical text that showed up in all these churches. That requires a physical transfer into the custody of another church. It requires a distribution network. And the churches, the apostles set up a very firm polity or form of government to ensure the preservation of the text to be handed down.
Good stuff, good stuff. Yeah, I mean, if we have a testimony of churches all around of this guy being the author, I mean, how can you discredit that? You know what I mean? So that's interesting that he would.
Everybody who copied the text made mistakes. Our first surviving copy of Mark probably dates to around the year 220 AD. That is 150 years after Mark was first produced. Our first complete copy of Mark comes from the year 350, about 280 years after Mark. We have lots of copies from later times. From thousands of years, if 1,000 years after Mark, we get lots of copies. When you compare all of these copies with one another, they all differ from one another. And what is striking is that the earlier you go to look at the manuscripts, the more differences you find. The earliest copies have the most mistakes. What would happen if we found copies that were still earlier? The only evidence we have is the evidence that survives, which suggests that in the early periods of copying, there was the most mistakes made. How many were made the first month, or the first year, or the first decade? How many mistakes were made in the copy of the copy of the copy, which served as the copy of all the copies that we now have? We have no way of knowing.
So let's stop right here for a second. So let's talk what he, and I want to kind of just reemphasize when Dr. Ehrman was referring to these early copies. Now, what Dr. Ehrman isn't saying, because he's kind of conflating all the evidence or all the extant documents together. Now, there's a thing called laying the foundation. It's a principal rule of law. So before you can offer an exhibit, in this case, when he's talking about the 3rd century document from Mark, before he can offer as evidence that, hey, I got this copy of Mark in the 3rd century, it has all these differences that don't look like the others. He needs to prove that it's authentic by laying a foundation for it. So he must demonstrate that he has sufficient knowledge to prove that the exhibit he's saying is an authentic representative of the Greek churches of the apostles. Because if it's not from the official churches, it's a document, and we know that there were other documents being produced outside of the churches that did not represent the official text of the church. There was a big case in the 2nd century. The Presbyter of North Africa, Tertullian, used the same argument against it. The version of the Gospel of Luke that you have, we have all Paul's churches, and they don't have that version of the Gospel of Luke in their churches, and we know where those churches come from. So Ehrman is making an assumption that the documents from the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century that he has are representatives from those churches. So you can't make that assumption unless you can lay a foundation or prove that. And he cannot. So what he has, he doesn't know. Did they belong to the churches? Who knows? Do they belong to some other group? Who knows? Assume they came from the churches. That is something that has to be proven. Now, the documents that Dr. Ehrman is referring to 1,000 years later, well, we can trace where those documents come from. The Church of Constantinople. We know the history of the church. We know the bishops that oversaw those churches. We know the type of text that was being read by those churches. And yes, they look very different from the documents that Dr. Ehrman is referring to. But fortunately for us, the documents that we can see being read in the churches look very different than the documents that Ehrman is hanging up. So yes, there's lots of errors in those documents because they're being produced by different groups that we don't know who they belong to. Now, this is different than the text that we see at Antioch, that we see the same type of text being represented in Constantinople in the 4th century. We see a very similar form of the text being represented by Jerome. And in Jerome's Vulgate, he can testify to what the Vulgate is. It's a comparison. It's based on old Greek manuscripts. So it's interesting that the documents that Ehrman is citing, supposedly to be representative of the texts that were used by the churches of Greek Orthodox Church, it doesn't look like the text that is represented in Jerome's Vulgate. And the fact that Augustine in North Africa, even though he had questions about Jerome and his translation, vetted the Greek, the gospel translations against independent Greek texts and said, hey, no, this looks good. What you said that you were tasked to do in restoring the Latin to the form of the original Greek, that's what you've done. What Dr. Ehrman has done is provided us with a smokescreen. It's like, don't look at the church text because those must be wrong. We're looking at these documents where we don't know where they come from, and these must be the correct text because they're earlier. But once again, historically, the culture and the environment in the ancient world where Christianity did not have legal status, you had other groups in the ancient world that was also producing texts. I think even in the New Testament, we read that there were other people that the disciples came to Jesus and said, hey, there's other people, casting out demons in your name. Do you think
Yeah.
they didn't have little scriptures that they were using either?
Yeah.
We know of a lot of groups that were using other scriptures apart than what was official in those churches. But we wouldn't go up and say, these are the best representative. This will come from the church. This is coming from a separate group. So you can't compare what hasn't come from the church and saying there's all these differences, so those must be wrong. And what we have is an evolutionary approach.
Yeah, so I think that's where textual criticism comes into play, right? I mean, you take these bunch of you take these bunch of manuscripts and you say, okay, these manuscripts over here seem to be the correct ones that line up with the biblical text we have today. While these, though they may be similar, because there are some major errors in these manuscripts, we cannot say that these line up with what we have according to, you know, the earliest manuscript evidence. So I think that's probably the key, right?
Yeah, the thing is, we get our money from the bank. We don't go looking in trash cans, because what you might found is counterfeit cash. And what we're saying is the churches of the apostles had a system to set up that was set up to preserve the text against evidence. And because we don't just have one church, but thousands of churches that the apostles set up to transmit the Bible to, it wasn't just given to one church. It wasn't just given to Rome or Antioch. It was given to all their churches. So the fact is, we have multiple independent lines that we can compare against. And this is where textual criticism comes in. Now, what Dr. Ehrman is saying is, don't go to the bank to get your money. You look at the money at the banks, they all look the same, but don't trust it. Go to the garbage can, because that's where we're going to find the real cash. And that's what he's doing in this situation. He's discrediting the text that is represented by the church, saying, hey, we have this. Now, what Dr. Ehrman didn't tell you is, we have very little from the ancient world, but we have all these texts from the 9th, the 10th, the 11th century, but we can't trust those. But when we look at the age of manuscripts, when we look at the Jewish texts, the earliest extant version of the official Jewish text is from the 9th and 10th century. The same age we find surviving, so the survivability rate is the same. But yet they're not questioning the reliability. Well, in some ways they are, but of the Jewish canon. Same survivability rate that we see with the Old Testament do we see with our New Testament documents.
All right. Let's listen to see what else Bart has to say.
We have a way of knowing how the gospel was changed in its first 100 years. I want to know what the answer is, because I've worked on this problem for 30 years, and I don't know of a way to know, and I've never seen a good explanation. You can't argue that that we have lots and lots of copies of Mark, and therefore we know what was originally in Mark. These lots and lots of copies are from many centuries after Mark was written. How could we know that these copies stem from a correct copy instead of an errant copy? Our earliest ones are all highly errant. Sometimes you will hear Christian apologists say that the New Testament is the best attested book from antiquity, and therefore you can trust it. It's true it's the best attested book from antiquity, but the attestation is all from 1,000 years later. It doesn't make sense to say that you can trust it because it's well attested. If the New Testament was well attested, then you could say what the New Testament originally said. Whether you should trust it or not.
I mean, if the New Testament is well attested, doesn't that in itself show that the evidence that we have, the manuscript evidence that we have, and we critique and we took through, we criticize it, textual criticism, the whole nine, does that not show that that because we have the New Testament, doesn't that show that evidence of the profitability of the New Testament? That it's if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. So what he leaves out there is like, well, how do you know it didn't come from a corrupt source? Well, we know they came from the churches. So those are the reliable vehicles for the transfer of the text, because we know we have documentation that the text came in possession from the apostles to those they appointed to oversee the church. So when we talk about establishing a chain of custody, it's almost like the policeman gathering the evidence on scene and putting it over for deposit so they can use it in court years later to bring it up. Even though it's years later, there's nothing wrong with the evidence. The fact of the matter is we have churches that came into possession of the text, so we can trace them back. This isn't imaginary. We have physical lists from all these ancient churches that trace back from the very beginning. So we understand who oversaw these churches. So we have a line of succession going back. So the question is, one church or anyone can go in and you can have a corrupt congregation member, you can have a corrupt copyist. Yeah, someone can try to alter documents in a particular church. We are all humans. But how do they do that in all the churches? I mean, you're talking about thousands of churches, thousands of miles away, not only coming up with the same testimony, but representing basically the same type of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John that we have across the board. So the question is, there are errors, but all the churches weren't making the same errors. The copyists were. So when we can compare the ones from the churches, that's how you spot the errors, because unless there's collusion going on, no one makes the same error. I mean, if we're copying a book, you and I, Marlon, what's the probability that we're going to make the same errors in the text? And if we have a third person down there copying the text, you would naturally say wherever two agree, they would be the same. And I'll bring this up to you because you were in the Navy, so you should hopefully know about this. But on some of the shipping vessels, it's pretty customary, the navigation equipment, because if two of them go down or one of them go down, you would look at the ones that are pretty consistently the same. And by looking at it, maybe two of the clocks, they started breaking down, their times are off. But the ones where they're equal or consistent, that's where you would say they were correct. So when we look at textual criticism, we obviously want to do a comparison between the churches that were put in the position to be guardians and witnesses of the text. And we don't only have one, we have thousands of churches that were put in a position to be guardians and witnesses. And we go to those actual witnesses. Yeah. Now, we can't pick up documents from a trash can or find something dug up in ancient Egypt and say, this must be the true text. I don't know why it was buried in the sand if it was true. I would expect to find the text in the churches. And that's what Irenaeus says, go to the churches. He doesn't say, listen to me. He said, go to the churches, see for yourself. Tertullian in North Africa argues the same way. He tells all the groups, go to the official churches of the apostles, and there you'll see the official text being read. He could have said, with all his authority, trust me, hear what I said, but he says, we have an objective framework, go to the churches, and this is what you'll find. And so Dr. Ehrman, he leaves out of his equation the physical churches that a lot of them were there in the first century. These other churches are descending from those churches from the missionary work that they did. So they were put in a direct line of succession to someone that goes back to the apostles. I can't ask for a stronger case in terms of authorship, in terms of authority for the text, if we can trace the lineage and history of that text back to the apostles. And this is what happened with the Gnostic texts. They couldn't show where they were from, where the churches of the apostles can show that these texts trace back physically to the apostles. And so the texts that he's talking about 1,000 years later, well, we know the history of the Church of Constantinople. We know the history of the Church of Antioch. Those are churches of the apostles that were set up and organized under their leadership. So the texts that were handed down to their church, unless there was some big conspiracy happening during the first 400 years of Christianity, apart from some basic scribal errors or some copyist mistakes, why wouldn't that be a faithful representative of the text? And when we compare the Church of Antioch and Rome and Athens and Constantinople and to our Aramaic brothers in Edessa with the Maronite Church and the Palestinian, why not, when we look at all those churches, why is this, there's an allegation that the churches falsified their documents. They were under oversight to preserve the text, and you have people in there just changing things up. But the fact of the matter is, I can't change up a text over here in Texas, and you change up a text in California, Marlon, and they both look alike. Unless we're calling each other, sharing our notes. But what Bart Ehrman doesn't want to talk about is the extant documentation we have that can be traced back to the church. They look a lot like each other. Yeah, there's some differences, but that just shows they're independent. So think about in a court trial, when you have many witnesses to a crime, and while they give their perspective, and there may be some small differences, the basic facts are all still there. They all said that person did it. Whether he did it with his left hand or he did it with his right hand, this is the person that did it. And what we have between all these churches is actual physical witnesses that were in possession of these texts that they were given to, that we can compare and make differences of. What Dr. Ehrman wants to get us off on documents that have no relevance to New Testament preservation, because you have to prove those documents are from the official churches. If not, it's like conducting a test in a dirty test tube. You're going to get bad results. So you can't compare documents that have documents received by the church and saying, look how different they are. And even though they look much better 1,000 years later, that must mean they don't change it. No, what it means is you have to prove that the documents you have are actually from the churches. Otherwise, it's irrelevant. You can't bring it to a court of law to prove your case. All you're doing is making up hearsay documents.
Interesting stuff. Interesting stuff. Let's see what else. Well, so I guess what we're going to do is we're going to not necessarily skip, but we're going to mess with Bart a little bit, and then we're going to skip ahead to Shabir Ali and get some of his critiques in. All right?
Not is another question. But the reality is we have lots of late manuscripts of Mark and of every other book of the New Testament. We don't have early ones, and the earliest ones we have are filled with mistakes.
Question number 5. Do archaeologists and historians use the Gospels as sources?
It's very easy to answer the question whether the archaeologists use the Gospels as sources. The answer is flat out no. Archaeologists dig to find material remains from antiquity, and their digs are not based on the study of literary texts such as the New Testament Gospels, as any bona fide archaeologist will tell you. But historians, of course, do use the Gospels as sources, principally as sources for knowing about the life of the historical Jesus. They have to, because there are no other sources that are reliable that exist, which leaves us with a problem, since the only sources that do exist are the Gospels, and they're not reliable either. There's no doubt that the historical Jesus is the most important person in the history of Western civilization. There is no doubt of that at all, in my opinion. But the unfortunate thing about Jesus is that we have such scanty documentation about his life. Most people don't realize this. But Jesus is never mentioned in any Greek or Roman non-Christian source until 80 years after his death. There is no record of Jesus having lived in these sources. In the entire first Christian century, Jesus is not mentioned by a single Greek or Roman historian, religion scholar, politician, philosopher, or poet. His name never occurs in a single inscription, and it is never found in a single piece of private correspondence. Zip references. The first time Jesus is mentioned in a Roman source or a Greek source is by the Roman governor of a province of Asia Minor, a governor named Pliny, in the year 112, 80 years after Jesus' death. And even then, Pliny doesn't even name him Jesus. He simply refers to his name Christ in passing. That is the only reference within 80 years of Jesus' death. Jesus is mentioned 2 times, very, very briefly, by the Jewish historian Josephus in the year 93, over 60 years after his death, but he's mentioned in no other Jewish source of the 1st century at all. If you want to know about Jesus, you have to turn to Christian sources. There is no choice. The earliest Christian source is the Apostle Paul. But to the surprise of many Bible readers, Paul scarcely mentions anything about Jesus' words and deeds while he's living.
Don't we have, this is sort of, I think we have the Roman historian Tacitus, and we also have, we have mentions of him in the Talmud, right? Where they're referencing Jesus as well, right?
Yeah, so what Dr. Ehrman is trying to make a case is within antiquity, we don't, or within the years surrounding the life and death of Jesus, we don't have any non-contemporary witness attestation. So, and let me explain how we speak to that. First, the witnesses in a particular case that saw someone do it, the defense is normally going to argue, well, you can't trust them. They're biased. They saw him do it. So we can't count any of their testimony, which is just ridiculous. You can't say the people that actually saw him and give testimony to him can't be reliable because they're biased. Which is not contemporary followers of Jesus speak on his behalf. So the Gospels, and once again, published all over the ancient world in Greek, Latin, and Aramaic, and there's no official tome or counter narrative to debunk the reports that's laid out in the Gospels. So, so first he dismisses testimony from people that knew him. So just because they may be biased because they're Christians, so that means they're all wrong. Now, secondly, on Tacitus. Now, Tacitus in his Annuals does give a very detailed description of the origins of Christianity, coming out of Judea. He speaks of this evil that has kind of permeated its way all the way to Rome. And throughout the empire, he speaks of, and he speaks of its leader, Chrestus, that was crucified under the governor Pilate. And he speaks of their strange superstitions that had originated out of the area of Judea. Now, once again, Bart Ehrman, Dr. Richard Carrier, they'll like to say that Tacitus is, he's probably heard this from Christian friends, which you're just making that up because Tacitus doesn't say that. And what we do see from Tacitus in his writings is he constantly refers to records because once again, this is his Annuals, the records of Rome. So where is he getting this information from? Now, Tacitus tells us on several occasions that he finds records in the Senate. He talks about historians in government journals that he refers to in the writings of his Annuals. So the question is, and even though they bring up about the spelling of the name, well, someone overhearing that name, or a soldier or someone, would take that down, and this is why we see misspellings in the naming of Chrestus in Suetonius, and we see it in Tacitus. The reference, well, where is he getting that information from? But from documents. And throughout Tacitus's writings, he tells us where he gets a lot of his information from. So he's going to government records. He's going to records of the Senate. So the fact of the matter is, this would be consistent that Tacitus is referring to government reports about Jesus. Suetonius, another one who, even though he was very superstitious himself, refers to the group of the Christians. He does speak of the Jews' expulsion at Rome at the incitement of Acrestus, which kind of really correlates to Christianity coming to Rome, that we can see from Acts and throughout history that churches were set up there that Tacitus speaks about. But once again, where are they getting this information from? But, Suetonius grabs a lot of stuff from documents that he tells us in his writings as well that was available. And it's interesting that both Tertullian and Justin Martyr speak of Governor Pilate's taking this information of Jesus and his resurrection and his miracles on the reports to Tiberius, which is consistent with what we see within Roman history. So the fact that there's no government report, Tertullian and Justin Martyr refer to Senate records that was brought before them by Tiberius that spoke of Jesus. Tacitus and Suetonius and Pliny had records to Rome in conducting their histories that they tell us about. So the fact that even though Pliny is writing around 112, they're referring to ancient Roman documents that do testify to Jesus and what had occurred.
Yeah, I think it's clear to say that. I think it's cool to say, or fair to say, should I say, that Bart Ehrman has a little bit of confirmation bias going on there. It's pretty clear of what he's doing.
Well, and now, apart from the Christian writings, which are all over, which should speak to not only the reliability, but the documents that Tacitus, Suetonius, and Pliny are referring to, is obviously they're referring to government documents based on the constant mention of these documents in their writings. So they don't speak about Christians, passing on information. And if in fact Christian or Tacitus was speaking to Christians, that means they were pretty high up in the Roman Empire, which meant that Christians have infected the Roman Empire. Because who would be able to get a conversation with Tacitus if you weren't high up there? So, yeah. I think Dr. Ehrman is, while he's correct in saying that Tacitus doesn't mention it until 80 years after, it's pretty clear that he's referring to ancient documents as he's doing for the rest of his work, that he's supplying this information. He's giving us really detailed accounts of where Christianity originated from, where it spread to. It talks about our superstitions. So he speaks about, Pilate's crucifixion. Where would he get an idea that Pilate crucified some Jew, except from documents that were made available in the historical archives?
Yeah. It's interesting when you put everything together. You know what I mean? When you sum everything together and really look at the fine details that would be required to happen in order for him to be able to know these things. It really makes a strong case. So let's I guess, is there anything in particular like you really wanted to interact with as far as this portion? I can skip up to that if you want me to.
I think that was it. I think when we look at the Bible as history and archaeologists and historians using it, I think what can't be, forgot is the fact that because of a discovery of the Delphi, which was an inscription at Delphi that was published in 1905, it allows us to date fairly accurately Gallio's proconsulship in Acts, which allows us to establish a central timeline for Paul's ministry and literary career. So the fact that we can't authenticate history from that period is incorrect. We can, and that's one of the prime examples that we can, along with the pool of Bethsaida that's mentioned in John's gospel, that because of a recent discovery, we can confirm it's true. So we have these historical statements of fact that we can document and verify, which lends to reliability of the source and its history.
All right, all right. All right, so now we got here Shabir Ali. So as you can see, I think this is part of his opening statement for a debate he might have had with Dr. Mike Licona. I can't remember exactly. But this is the opening statement. And as you can see, Jesus is in the New Testament picture of him accurate. Does it paint him accurately? All right. So as you know, Muslims, they also believe in the Jesus Christ, not the Jesus Christ in the Bible. It's a false representation of Christ. But you know, they argue and say that the Christ we serve is the wrong Christ. So this is Shabir Ali's opening statement. So once again, audience, Jonathan is going to take some questions at the end. After the end of our interaction with this last portion. So get those questions in if you have them. Let me start this video real quick.
Well, for coming out here tonight, I want to begin by praising our Creator and Fashioner, the Creator of the heavens and the earth. I ask Him, God, please have mercy on all of us here tonight. Guide our hearts, give us an open mind, and clear our thoughts of any misgiving, of any hatred towards anyone else in this room. Let us have a free spirit of open conversation, of brotherhood in one humanity, and followers of the sister religions of Abraham. Now, to get onto our topic tonight, so our subject is about Jesus, and is the New Testament picture of him accurate? I'd like to start by, first of all, saying where the Quran stands on this, because although that is not our topic, naturally, folks will want to know, here is a Muslim, what's the Muslim perspective on this? So how does Jesus appear in the Quran? Jesus is said to have had a miraculous birth. He is shown to have performed many miracles, including healing the blind, curing the leper, even raising the dead. In the Quran, Jesus is shown to have many important titles. For example, he's called Messiah of God, which may be surprising to some of our Christian friends. He's called a Word of God and also Spirit of God. Jesus' message in the Quran is said to be focused on the idea that there is only one God, which is the message that, according to the Quran, was given by all of the prophets, including Abraham and Moses and now eventually Jesus. And Jesus also spoke about following the straight path, which for Muslims would mean that he, as the Quran says, confirmed the law that was there before him, although the Quran shows that he made some modification to some of the strictures of the law. So if on the one hand we conceive of a Judaism that is very strictly legalistic, and we think of some forms of Protestant Christianity that does not have much to do with...
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit to see if we can get to the arguments.
Message, speaks 3 verses 78 to 80. I'm just people in this and the 70. I mean, Quran 3 perhaps and would not part of to portray the idea that the Quran must be true. On the one hand, it seems to be acknowledging that the Bible is such a good book. And then on the other hand, the Quran teaches things which are different from what the Bible teaches, and therefore the Quran must be wrong by its own standards, approving the book and yet differing from it. But Sidney Griffith has pointed out that the Quran is very clear, that the previous scriptures contain some mistakes and misunderstandings, and the Quran has come to correct that picture that was there previously. So let's move on then and look at Jesus in the Bible, more particularly the New Testament. He did hear a voice. Back in chapter 9, Paul was said to be on the road to Damascus, and Jesus appeared to him as a bright light. So we want to compare Acts chapter 9, verse number 7, with Acts chapter 22, verse number 9. And comparing these, we will find that in the chapter 9 verse, Those with Paul did hear a voice, but in the 22nd chapter, those who were with Paul did not hear the voice. Now, that's my poor summary of the verses in question. Let's look at the actual verses. And I have to beg your pardon here because I know many folks here are very interested in using the King James Version of the Bible, but pardon me because my English is not that good, and I have to rely on the New King James Version because it's put in modern English. So here you have it. And the men who journeyed with him stood speechless, hearing a voice, but seeing no one. That's Acts chapter 9. Then we go to chapter 22, and those who were with me, Paul says, indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. So either they heard in Acts chapter 9, or they didn't hear in Acts chapter 22. So here we have a difficulty with accepting the documents as they are. Again, the passages are Acts chapter 9, verse 7, Acts chapter 22, verse number 9. Let's move on to another example. Now, here I want to look at the date of Jesus' ascension. Muslims do actually believe that Jesus ascended into heaven. The Quran says so in Surah 4, verse number 158. How and when, the Quran does not specify. But Muslims would be willing to accept the narratives that are here in the Christian Bible. But which one are we to accept as to the date of the ascension? In Luke, we have it that Jesus ascended on Easter evening, and in Acts of the Apostles, 40 days later. That is repeated in my oncoming slide. So Easter evening in the Gospel according to Luke, and 40 days after Easter in the Acts of the Apostles. Now, both of these documents are written by the same individual. You can check it out yourself. The relevant verses are Luke chapter 24, verse number 51, and then Acts of the Apostles. Can we get to Acts of the Apostles? Hello. Okay. Chapter 1, verse number 9. So we cannot have it on the two different dates. You can, of course, have Jesus ascending, coming back, dwelling with his disciples some more, and then ascending one more time. But that's not the character of the narratives. Luke's gospel seems to close it off. That's it. He has appeared to his disciples. This looks like the end of the matter. And then the disciples go back to praising God in the temple. So case is closed. Then Acts of the Apostles, case is reopened. Now we have the space for Jesus to appear to his disciples over a period of 40 days. And so the story is expanded and is made more Christian with the retelling. More evidence is given of Jesus appearing to his disciples, not once or twice, but now over a period of 40.
I mean, what are we dealing with here? I mean, as far as I guess, and this is what all skeptics try to do. They try to find areas where, it seems like it's a contradiction, or it seems like a particular text doesn't work well, or it's going against a verse that we've seen previously. Or what we do is they will say, in the book of Matthew it says this, in the book of Mark it says this, instead of allowing the author to have different perspectives.
Yeah, I think what they need to understand, and this is common in a court of law. I actually like John Chrysostom, which was a famous preacher at the Church of Antioch in 385, and became the Patriarch of Constantinople. He kind of talks to this particular issue in laying the evidence of what are we seeing here. So I kind of want to quote it because he says it better than I can ever say it. But he says, if there be four that write, in referencing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not at the same time, nor in the same places, neither after having met together and converse with one another, and they all speak all things as it were out of one mouth, because we do see a very consistent message on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It becomes a very great demonstration of the truth. Now, it may be said on the contrary that if it had come to pass, for in many places they disagree, but this very thing is very great evidence of the truth. For if they had agreed in all things exactly, even to time and place and to the very words, it would be evidence of collusion. Because if you think about it, just like witnesses in a court of law that are giving their testimony or their vantage point on what is happening, now, I get the defense attorney will try to pick that apart, but what they're looking for is the basic facts in alignment. Are we talking about the same person here, the same place, the same event occurring? Now, there may be some differences on, okay, was he wearing a short sleeve shirt or a long sleeve shirt? What I got out of, from my vantage point, may be a little different, but if everything was all the same between these four books, it would naturally lead to conclusion like these four people got together and started copying each other. Let me copy, because what we see is there's differences. While there's extreme harmony between the account, there are differences which show there are independent testimonies on the life, death, and resurrection. And because the basic facts all agree, what we're seeing here is a different vantage point on what is being reported as opposed to what is not being reported. So in the case of Judas, he was hanging from the tree, so one of the authors makes notion of that perspective where he hung himself. Now, the other one talks about finding his body kind of exploded out in the field. Well, from the perspective of what happens when you hang yourself and you lay out there in the sun, your body fills up with liquid, you get all this weight, you fall down to the floor, you explode. Well, that is the aftermath of what happened with that. Now, the thing we do have is we have Joseph of Arimathea owning the tomb. We have a tomb in Jerusalem, the boulder moving away, and the body not being there. Now, there's different remarks in there about with the guards. He talks about the body being stolen away. So there's information, but the basic facts of a body that was crucified and being buried in Jerusalem by a person named Joseph of Arimathea, and the stone was moved away, is all consistent with the facts. And Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are providing additional information from their vantage point on what they're sharing with their particular audience. Obviously, Mark, in the manner it is written, it is sermons that Peter is given to Rome, to his crowds. So it's going to be a summarized version of what happens. Luke, as the historian, is going to take a much different approach than how we preach on a sermon. And what naysayers or skeptics will do is kind of twist these perspectives, just like they do to witnesses in a court of law, to get us off the basic statements of facts that are being conveyed and to focus on the discrepancies. And that discrepancies is the vantage point that they're relaying the information.
Yep. I agree, man. I agree.
Days. So it does actually transform over time. Now let's look at another example regarding Jesus' genealogy.
And this is, and you remember when I asked you for it to come on for a debate. This is the subject that I wanted you to debate. Jesus' genealogy. You know what I mean? So let's see what Shabir has to say.
Yeah, I got a good answer for that. So
all right.
Thomas has given us a lot of ancient testimony saying that Matthew wrote the Gospel according to Matthew, and he was a disciple of Jesus and so on. But notice that he started with Papias, who was writing in the middle of the 2nd century. And he himself, in a way, challenged me to come back and give evidence from the 1st century onwards. But he didn't give any evidence from the 1st century of anyone who said that Matthew wrote this gospel. He came with Papias to begin with from the 2nd century, and then went on to Irenaeus and so on. But now let's look at the actual content to see if this person was writing a scripture that is infallible, inerrant, that we should trust in every respect. And I know the example I'm going to give here is somewhat trite. One might say in the end, who cares about these details? The main thing we want to know about is whether Jesus died for us and rose from the dead. But in order to get there, we have to start with the basics and look at real evidence to see whether or not these writers of the material before us actually were writing infallible and inerrant scripture. And if they were just writing as ordinary individuals, giving us some history that they knew, we can evaluate it from that perspective as well. So let's see what we find. We want to compare Matthew with 1 Chronicles in the Old Testament. So you would expect that the New Testament writers want to conform to the Old Testament, and that's the whole basis of Christianity. Without the Old Testament, the New Testament doesn't have any grounding. So the New Testament has to agree with the Old Testament. So does Matthew agree with 1 Chronicles? Now, in Matthew's rendering, we have the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, verses 8 to 9, and we want to compare that with 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 11 to 12. My clicker is on a delay mode or something like this. Hello? Hello, clicker. There we go. So we're going to look at these three names in Matthew's gospel in those verses that I mentioned, and look at the list starting with Joram and ending with Jotham. You can see that there is only one generation between Joram and Jotham. Now we go to 1 Chronicles, and we see that between Joram and Jotham, there are actually 4 generations. And it's possible that this person, Uzziah, is the same as Ahaziah, but then we still have 3 additional names. So how did Matthew get a shorter list like this? Now, Matthew makes a point about his list. He says, so there are 14 generations from Abraham to David, and then 14 generations from David to the exile, and then 14 generations from the exile to Jesus. So he wants a nice list of 14 plus 14 plus 14. The significance of this number has been discussed by scholars in the commentaries, and I don't want to delay us with that significance, but the point is that Matthew wants it to be 14. And in order for it to be 14, apparently he found it convenient to omit 3 names from the genealogical record, as was already there in the Old Testament. So he has a nice list of 14, but he has truncated the list. He's given us misinformation here, unfortunately. So here is the text as it reads, still in my truncated form, just to get to the root of the matter. Joram begat Uzziah, Uzziah begat Jotham. That's Matthew's gospel. But then when we go to the 1 Chronicles, it's Joram his son, Ahaziah his son, Joash his son, Amaziah his son, Azariah his son, Jotham his son, and that's the list given in 1 Chronicles. So that's a difficulty. Again, the passages are Matthew chapter 1, verses 8 to 9. You can look it up yourself. And 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 11 to 12. I have to move on. Another example.
All right, did you want to make a comment there, or you wanted to...
Once again, the genealogy or the alleged discrepancies in the Gospels in regard to the genealogy of Christ is well known and from ancient times on what is happening between both the genealogy presented in Matthew and what's being presented in Luke. Now, Eusebius, one of the first historians of the church under Constantine, actually provides us really good testimony from Julius Africanus, which goes over what we're seeing in here, because what they try to say is, oh yeah, well, they're making things up. Well, if you have 2 different books, if you want to give some credibility to your story, why, if they believe Matthew wasn't first, or in essence maybe second or third, why do you have 2 different genealogies in Matthew and Luke? It looks like they were setting up themselves for failure. But Julius Africanus actually explains. He says, so whereas the names of the generations were reckoned in Israel either according to nature or according to the law. So we have a split between what we see in Matthew and according to nature, or what that is prescribed by the law of Moses. And what he does, so there's neither of the gospels in error, because one reckons by nature, so the physical of two people coming together. The other is by law, so who has the inherited rights of the tribe? Because once again, we're talking about the Israel, their the law of Moses given to by nature, and what we see in both is that they're providing. And so what he talks about, he says, for the line of descent from Solomon and that from Nathan were so involved, the one with the other, by raising up of children to the childless and by second marriages, that the same persons are justly considered to belong at one time to one, at another time to another. That is, at one time the reputed fathers, at another time the actual fathers. So that both these accounts are strictly true and come down to Joseph with considerable intricacy indeed. But in order that what I have said may be made clear, I shall explain the interchange of the generations. Because if we reckon the generations from David through Solomon, the third from the end is found to be Mathan, who begat Jacob, the father of Joseph. But if with Luke we reckon them from Nathan, the son of David, in like manner, the third from the end is Malachi, whose son Eli was the father of Joseph. For Joseph was the son of Eli, the son of Melchi. Joseph, therefore, being the object proposed to us, it must be shown how it is that each is recorded to be his father, both Jacob, who derived his descent from Solomon, and Eli, who derived his from Nathan. First, how it is these two, Jacob and Eli, were brothers, and then how it is that their fathers, Mathan and Melchi, although of different families, are declared to be grandfathers of Joseph. This is a matter of what is recognized by law and what is being communicated by way of the natural delivering of the kid. So it's providing two perspectives of the audience that they're writing to. Obviously, Matthew, a Levite, writing to his Jewish people, is showing the natural progression of things. Now, once again, Paul or Luke, which is actually Paul's gospel that he's going around the Mediterranean, and obviously a Hellenistic Jew himself, he is conveying the dissension that's ascribed at law. So once again, they're both correct. There's no differences in them. It's just one that's going to be communicated by the natural order of things. Another, what is done by birthright, and who actually has the inheritance. So they're showing two different things, and it's interesting that Shabby is confusing those things. This is well documented very early in the ancient world on what is being communicated by Matthew, which set out to show the lineage of Jesus all the way back, and what Luke is doing in terming, prescribing the law that was handed down by Moses and the rule of inheritance. So what is the natural right that goes back through the legal precepts, and what is the natural through procreation?
Yeah, I also like to point out, as it concerns Matthew and First Chronicles, we have to understand that the whole concept of Matthew's genealogy is to point out the line of royalty, right? Because the whole narrative of the book of Matthew is the idea of the king has come, the Messiah has come, he is the king has stepped on the scene, if you will, So his lineage is specifically pointing out his royal line of descendants And obviously in First Chronicles, you're getting a more detailed of individuals who are not necessarily in the royal line. You know what I mean? They're not in the royal line. So those guys are omitted for that purpose, because Matthew has a particular audience he's speaking to, and he has a particular purpose of writing. And I think that's what we get when we encounter your Shabir Ali's and your Bart Ehrmans. You know, they're so centerline on refuting the Bible, is that they take common fundamental principles and they disregard them in order to try to conflate the errors in the Bible. And I just find that kind of disappointing. Shabir Ali presents himself as if he's someone who's willing to handle the biblical text with integrity and with honor and innocence. Not honor as far as having faith in it, but in honor as far as treating the academia of the Bible, as the academic aspects of the Bible, with care to properly represent. And it's clear that just simply is not the case when we have fundamental mistakes being done here. And it's disappointing, but that will probably be a proper response, a response to, Shabir trying to use First Chronicles to refute Matthew, so good stuff, man. So what I want to do now is that I want to get some questions in from the audience. I want to get those guys engaged a little bit. So we're going to retire Shabir. We're going to retire Bart Ehrman, and we're going to tackle some of these questions to see we can get some of these guys involved there. All right, so let me pull up these questions real quick. Where you at? All right, so there was a question here. I thought I saved it. Let me see. All right, here's a question here. All right, so the question popped up at the bottom. So a question for you. What would Jonathan say to a Catholic that uses local council of Carthage and Rome?
Well, once again, councils have shown to be wrong and an error, but even John Calvin, Luther, they were against Anabaptists in particular for rejection in terms of what has been handed down. Councils have erred. We understand that. And if we look at the Council of Carthage in 419 in particular, they were actually arguing against Rome, and particularly to the authenticity of Revelation. And what they say is, these are the documents that were handed down by the fathers to be read in the churches. And we are telling you, this is what has been received and come down to us and is witnessed by the independent churches of the apostles. And you are rejecting it. So that was a direct response from the North African church to Rome. And then after that, we see Rome give up. Because Rome, once again, Rome has been wrong. The churches in Alexandria have been wrong. Numerous councils have been wrong. So we're not ascribing anything, but there's a difference between rejecting basically the near universal consensus of the fathers on many issues. And the reformers really pointed that out to regarding the Anabaptists, how they reject the near universal consensus on a lot of these issues that have been worked out on.
All right. And we have another question here. Resurrected Eyes. Do we have evidence that Polycarp was a disciple of John? Richard Carrier says no. Any response, Jonathan?
Yes. So when we talk about evidence, we have documents from the ancient world from people that were in a position to know. So we have Irenaeus, who specifically says in his Against Heresies that that he was known of the apostles. We have a letter that Eusebius provides us in his histories where Irenaeus speaks of the conversations that Polycarp had in John. So it's a very detailed letter that Irenaeus remembers and recalls from Polycarp, who was his bishop at Smyrna. So he was there, he learned at his feet, he knew him, and in a separate letter that Eusebius provides in his histories, does detail conversations that John had with Polycarp that Polycarp was recalling. In addition, Tertullian, on the opposite side of the Roman Empire in North Africa, I think we got like 700 or 900 miles between Gaul and North Africa. Tertullian also says that Polycarp was appointed to be the bishop of Smyrna and over the churches of Asia Minor by the Apostle John. So we can corroborate that, and it is reported by Eusebius in his history. So in terms of, do we have evidence? Of course we can. We have actual testimony from those that were at that church. So if you think about it, we have letters from someone that actually knew Polycarp and conveyed his information. And we have Tertullian on the opposite side of the Roman Empire, very knowledgeable of the churches, the structure, and who had appointed who over the church there. And he says it too. So of course we have evidence. The question is, do you want to believe that document? Now, what they don't have is any documentation that refutes what Irenaeus and Tertullian says. And I think that's the most important thing that they have to remember. And while I've debated Dr. Richard Carrier twice, the question comes down to, do you have evidence against the documents from Tertullian and Irenaeus that says they're wrong? Because we can collaborate. We have actual documents that says yes, but they have no testimony that says anything that Irenaeus said in regard to that specific matter is wrong. They don't have any ancient father from the ancient church that says, no, Irenaeus was just making things up. We don't have that. What we actually have is two documents from two credible voices at different independent locations at the same time, 180 for Irenaeus and 190 for Tertullian. So why would we doubt that testimony? We know Polycarp was a bishop in Smyrna. Irenaeus grew up at that church as his business. He tells us in two separate documents, that he was known of the apostles. He was appointed there, and we have the same testimony coming from Tertullian. That's corroborated. That's substantiating their testimony.
All right. Good stuff. We have a skeptic that's in the audience right now, and he's been going to town the whole interview. His name is Jesse.
Okay.
So here's a statement that he's made. I would take out Matthew, Luke, Jude, and Peter. They have too many corruptions. And now, okay, Jesse, first of all, this is what I typically do. Whenever I run into atheists, it seems like you're an atheist who's an extreme skeptic. And whenever I run into atheists that make these claims of corruption, the first question I tend to ask individuals that are like Jesse, that had a mindset like Jesse, I ask them, show me the corruption. Show me the contradiction. Because typically what I've encountered over my time is that when confronted with that question, they can't present evidence that says this is the corruption. All right. So that accusation kind of fall flat on its face. You will remove Matthew, Luke, Jude, and Peter, but that accusation falls flat on its face when you are not able to present those said corruptions. So if you don't mind, I would love to interact with you. If you don't mind, please point a corruption in the chat. I'll post it, and me and Jonathan will interact with it. So let me ask you, Jonathan, would you remove Luke, Jude, Peter, and Matthew because of corruption?
No, and the fact of the matter is, when we look at Matthew, Luke, Jude, Peter, they were received by the majority of independent Greek, Latin, and Apostolic churches. Now,
Yeah.
this doesn't mean that they didn't have conversations about Second Peter, about Jude. They did discuss these things because they wanted to be sure. And there were controversies that rose up in the church that questioned the authorship of Paul in Hebrews, John in Revelations, that really stemmed from different issues. But why would we take them out? It's what we received. This is what has come down from us. The church was very aware of corruptions. They documented many attempts to kind of people to pass on texts that weren't from the apostles, and those were noticed. But they let all these other things creep in there, and they had no problem with it. These were people dying for their faith, so they were going to allow someone to come into their church and start adding corruptions.
Yeah, and, it's interesting. It's always interesting. I love saying that because it's always interesting when we deal with the skeptics and they bring up these accusations. So it's always interesting. I think another comment. I saw another comment from Jesse again. This one right here. And this is from the interactive with Shabir Ali. Was talking about the book of Acts and Luke, and he was comparing them for a said contradiction. And he says they can't have different perspectives if they're from the same guy. That is why it's more powerful to use Luke and Acts for contradictions. What would you say to that?
They can't have different if they're from the same guy. Well, no, and I think what happens with Luke is, once again, he's writing on Paul's ministry and providing additional information that's come about. I mean, he does refer to his earlier work and continues on. Once again, it's these alleged contradictions. They can't prove they're actually contradictions. What they're making is it appears to be a contradiction, but based on what? Their view or the way it comes across? Are we understanding the author's original intent? And I think even with Ali's, when he talks about, Paul's conversion experience, the basic statement of facts are basically the same. Now, Paul is given the perspective in that particular case. Now, whether they heard it or not, he can't really speak to. Where Luke does, as being a follower of Paul, said, hey, we heard it. This is what happened. That is different. Paul's giving his perspective on what his vantage point was. But, once again, these are alleged contradictions that they're saying, well, it can't be from. Everyone believes that, whoever wrote Acts also wrote Luke. What's it called? His perspective on what he's conveying later on, I don't see where the contradiction is.
Yeah. I think it just boils down to allowing the author to articulate what they're trying to say and taking the full biblical text into consideration. What is the overarching message this text is trying to convey? You know what I mean? So it's if we allow for that to happen, then I think that that we will understand what's going on, and that the contradictions that are or the apparent contradictions that people accuse the Bible of having will fall flat if we just allow the author to explain the story that they're trying to explain, or Paul trying to write the letter or explain the letter what he's trying to write. You know what I mean? It's allowing the author to author response instead of a reader's response to what's being articulated.
Yeah, and remember, Luke is writing in the Gospel of Luke, obviously Paul's Gospel. So it's Paul's Gospel being presented to the people. Now, what we have in Acts is the historical events of Paul's ministry. So, once again, both books are aimed at two different narratives. First, we have the Gospel, or Paul's Gospel, being conveyed by Luke. Because once again, Paul's going to all these churches speaking of the gospel. Well, he obviously has to have a gospel that he's preaching from if he's administering the gospel to all these churches and setting them up. So Luke is the gospel that Paul is using throughout when he's going out to all these to the Gentiles. Now Luke is taking notations on Paul's ministry journey. So there's two different perspectives being conveyed in Luke's gospel, or Paul's gospel of Luke, and what Luke is doing in recording the Acts or the official records of the apostles. Two different things are happening there. So to say two different perspectives, well, he's writing about two different things: the ministry and Acts of the apostles, and then the gospel of Jesus Christ. So two different perspectives he's writing to in those two different books.
Yeah. All right. So Jesse showed up again, and he's actually said that he's a Christian, but he had to let go of the virgin birth on the basis of how Matthew and Luke differ, and how Mark doesn't even mention it, and Paul also doesn't. So if we're talking about the genealogy of Matthew, we're talking about pinpointing the lineage of the king, a royal lineage. We're pointing that out in order to so the reader can understand that this is what the book of Matthew is encompassing. This is what the book of Matthew is going to be talking about for the most part. And when we're talking about the Luke's genealogy, it's more summarized, because now we're talking about it's coming from Mary's lineage. We're talking about Mary's lineage. It's no longer talking about the royalty. All right, so that's why you see different individuals. You may not see the exhaustive list that you see in Matthew. You won't see that in Luke, because the narrative has changed somewhat now. We're not talking about the royal lineage. So you have to give grace where grace is due, and you have to allow room for that. If you're not allowing room for that, then I don't know how you're going to interpret any book, Jesse. I don't know how you're going to have a satisfactory interpretation of any book if you do not allow the author to tell the story. Once again, we have to allow an author response to the text. We cannot allow a reader response, because when we allow a reader response to the text, now we're allowing the reader's presuppositions to infiltrate the text. And now the text is going to be interpreted in a manner that is not justified. Now you're going to get these off-wing theologies of which we see today. But when you allow the author response to the text, now you're allowing the author to tell the story, which is going to help with a proper interpretation. Now, you may not have liked that explanation. You may not appreciate that explanation. But if you want a proper understanding of the text, you are going to have to allow the author to explain what the author is saying. I don't know what else to tell you, Jesse. You got anything to add on that, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, he said, well, Paul doesn't mention it. And what we have to understand about what Paul's doing in his epistles is, and once ago, Paul does mention it because the Gospel of Luke is Paul's gospel. They understood this in the ancient world. Even the heretic Marcion referred to Luke's gospel, or Luke, as the gospel of Paul. So Paul does mention it in Luke because that's his gospel. Secondly, what we have to understand, in Paul's epistles, he's dealing with a different issue. In Judaism, it's called as responsa literature. Very common in Jewish literature. What Paul is doing is laying down evangelical precepts to the churches that he's speaking to. So he's laying down evangelical precepts or laws for the church in governing its body. But Paul does mention the virgin birth in his Gospel of Luke, because that is Paul's gospel. And once again, Luke, who was Paul's companion, would have had access to Mary. Obviously, meeting up with Peter and John, he would have had access to Mary, and it's naturally he's going to go and set up the genealogy according to her. So this is what we see happening when Luke goes to his witnesses, and he's getting the account from her. And then, obviously, Matthew, who is a Hebrew and trying to descend it back, going through Joseph. So this is what we're seeing between the natural and the legal. Joseph, obviously, being the legal heir, tracing back, and then that from Mary. And we see this with their relations. Obviously, Paul knew Peter, visited him. Luke is there. So the people that he can get the information from, obviously, Peter, Mary, John, James, and so forth. So that's who he had access to. And that's where he was able to get his information.
All right, cool. That seems to be the last question for this show. And thank you, Jonathan, for a good rundown. I appreciate you, man. And it's always fun to have these type of discussions. They're much needed to have, right? And I appreciate you, man. Keep doing your thing, man. And I'll reach out to you in about 6 months to see if you're ready for that debate, man. Because I gotta get you in for one, man.
Yeah,
gotta get you in, man.
Jim, there's certain I've debated Jim before in the past on a couple of different issues. I think that one, just with everything that was going on with traveling and just being burnt out from the last debate. But I wouldn't mind coming on your show doing a debate. Let's get a fun subject to kind of get into. Don't even mind doing some theological topics. Those can always be fun.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah, I love the theology, man. Theology is so good, so fun to deal with, man. But I'll get you in, Jonathan, man. And I thank you once again, Jonathan. I appreciate everything you're doing. And as I said before we started all the show, I'm praying for you and everything. And I pray for your family and praying for your ministry, man. Keep doing what you're doing. And, stay encouraged, man.
Thanks. God bless to you and your ministry and your family. And talk with you soon.
All right. All right, folks, another great one. I'm starting to get the whole interview vibe back. It's been sort of a downside with the interviewing because all the debates I had scheduled, but I'm starting to get in the rhythm of all the interviews, man. I have like 3 or 4 interviews after this one that are coming up, man. I have some great shows coming up. As you know, as I said in the beginning, I have Pastor Milo Ramos. He's going to be joining me tomorrow. We're going to be stepping through Romans chapter 9. So make sure you're on the lookout for that show. Make sure you're hitting the notification bell. I'm trying to see if I can change the time though. Right now I have it for 4. I might try to get it bumped up to 1 or 1:30 because I have some stuff going on that evening. So I may try to adjust the time there. But nonetheless, I do have Pastor Emilio Ramos coming, and we're gonna be doing some Romans chapter 9 stuff. So before I get out of here, I just want to express to you, the gospel, right? The title of this show is called The Gospel Truth for a reason. It is not just to talk about debates or interviews. It's about the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? The gospel of Jesus Christ. Christ died, bled for our sins. He bled and died for our sins, resurrected with all power, and it is the power of God, the regenerating of the heart by God that draws people to himself, right? And I'm praying that God will do a major work in your heart. Perhaps this interview has been helpful. Perhaps God will use use this interview as a means upon bringing you to grace and bringing you to salvation in him. So I'm just hoping that you will take everything that's being said into consideration, ponder these things, and I pray that the power of God would change your heart, regenerate your heart, and bring you to a salvific relationship with him, Jesus Christ. And I pray that you will come to Christ. That is my hope, and that's my prayer for you, that you will accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and that he will come and do amazing work in your heart. All right. That said, I'm going to get out of here. Great show, Jonathan. Good stuff, man. And thank you, audience, for joining me this evening. Thank you. May God bless you. I am gone.